Active voice. Sharp, pointed, often witty commentary on current events in Jamaica, the Caribbean, India and the world. Our Man in Mona, a conversation between Robert A. Hill and Annie Paul. Ap. Bobby, you first articulated a certain discomfort with the 1960 Rastafari report put out by the University of the West Indies in 2008 at the M.G. Smith conference. What led you to have doubts about the report and what was the general reaction at the conference to your voicing them? I might have started out chipping away at the mythology surrounding the university report, entitled The Rastafari Movement in Kingston, 1960. Today, my research has resulted in the dismantling, root and branch, of the intellectual pretensions of the report as well as exposure of the massive deception engaged in by all concerned with the report, a deception that until now has gone completely unremarked in the literature. Getting to the bottom of truth of what today stands as an almost canonical university document, more than 50 years after publication, has not been easy, but with patience and considerable effort and determination I have uncovered materials in archives and personal collections that disclose an unvarnished picture. The story that emerges from this research is a disturbing one, indeed. The first articulation of, as you describe it, a certain discomfort with the 1960 Rastafari report, however, long predated the M.G. Smith conference at UWI in 2008. In 1981, 27 years before the conference, I observed by way of introducing my essay, Dread History, Leonard P. Howell and Millenarian Visions in Early Rastafari Religion in Jamaica, a Poche, Journal of the History of Religions at UCLA, Volume 9, 1981, the following caution. It is necessary at the outset to call into question the semi-canonical status which scholars have conferred on the section of the report by M.G. Smith, Roy Augier and Rex Nettleford, the Rastafari Movement in Kingston, Jamaica, entitled History of the Movement. An example of the nearly universal acceptance accorded this work is the statement by Barry Chavan that the role played by the first Rastafarians is treated adequately in Smith al. Thus, engaging with the report in 2008 was by no means something I was attempting for the first time. What was new, however, was the approach. Since the conference was an academic meeting in honor of M.G. Smith, I decided that I would visit Smith's widow, Mary Smith, who lives in Glastonbury, England. I wanted to find out from her what she could tell me about the preparation of the report. I was reminded that, in a meeting held in my office at UCLA in 1978, M.G. Smith, who was then visiting UCLA with his wife, told me that the report was actually dictated to Mary over the course of a single night. How could one ever forget something as amazing as that? Indeed, Smith's statement stayed with me over the years and continued to make me curious about how the process of composition, dictation, transcription, and revision unfolded. M.G. Smith. Just before New Year's in 2007, I spent 3 days with Mary Smith in Glastonbury. During my visit I interviewed her at some length. The interview covered a lot of ground, including subjects like the response of Jamaicans to the Smiths' arrival in Jamaica in 1952. M.G. Smith and his wife had spent 20 months in the Hausa Fulani Emirate of Zazzau in northern Nigeria in 1949-1950. After returning to London in late December 1950, M.G. Smith wrote up the results for his Ph.D. thesis as a report to the Colonial Social Science Research Council in the summer of 1951. This work would form the bedrock of his illustrious reputation in the anthropological profession for years to come. I was curious to find out how Jamaicans perceived and responded to the connection with Africa. The result was that I decided to present, as my contribution to the proceedings of the 2008 conference, extracts from my conversation with Mary Smith in December 2007. One of the topics touched upon in the interview was the view I had arrived at by then that the report represented a plural society document, i.e., it reflected Smith's distinctive theory of cultural pluralism in the Caribbean, with its inflections about the clash of cultural segments and the potential that it created for societal breakdown. This seemed fairly obvious to me, for how could it not? Mary Smith strenuously disagreed with my observation, however, and she refused to give an inch, in fact, she wouldn't hear of it. As it turned out, M.G. Smith confirmed the correctness of my view about the plural society underpinning of the report. Thus, in a lengthy letter that I discovered only last year, Smith explained to the anthropologist Melville J. Huskowitz how the report came about. On my return from Evanston and Los Angeles in May 1960, I found a large-scale conspiracy had been uncovered in my absence, and that there was considerable unrest among the unemployed in Kingston, especially among the Rastafari group whom George Simpson had studied in 1955. In June there was further trouble when some racist American Negroes came down to offer a revolt. In our plural society, there being no communication between the Creole middle and lower class, when the opportunity arose I got the college, UCWI, to undertake a study of this Rastafari group, and carried it out with two other colleagues, M. G. Smith to Melville J. Huskowitz, Northwestern University, November 19, 1960. Even though Mary Smith and I disagreed on this point, I thought it was important to share this part of our exchange, namely, the status of the report vis-a-vis Smith's plural society theory, with the conference. You will appreciate how dumbfounded I was therefore, when following my presentation Roy Augier took the floor and launched into a tirade against what I had read from the transcript of the interview with Mary Smith. I simply could not fathom what he was getting at. What I understood, however, was that he was declaiming that I did not know anything about what I was talking about, that I was talking nonsense. What had set him off, it appeared, was the comment that I had made to the effect that from the text of the report there would seem to have been a division of labor among the three investigators, Smith, Augier, and Nettleford, viz. Augier the historian largely responsible for the newspaper research appearing in the second chapter on the history of the movement, Nettleford the researcher of Jamaican dance and folk music responsible for the section on borough drumming in the third chapter, and Smith himself responsible for the rest of the report. In point of fact, the idea was not mine, it came directly from Mary Smith who suggested it in the interview. In any case, Augier took serious umbrage at my attribution to him of responsibility for doing the newspaper research for the historical section of the report. Fair. Th. Enough, if he had not done the newspaper research, he could simply have corrected the mistake. Instead, he went totally off, as anyone who was present in the audience at the conference would tell you. The more significant point, however, is that Augier's attack in reality begged the question, if he had not done any of the newspaper research for the report, what exactly had he done? At this point, what if anything Augier contributed to the report is far from clear. Now, as to what the general reaction at the conference was to my presentation or to Augier's rant, I can't say. I suspect that most people present were left more than a little mystified by the whole thing. I was at that conference and I remember younger scholars leaping to Augier's defense as if they assumed that he had been wronged and that as one of the authors he should have the definitive last word on anything to do with the report. In April this year you gave a pretty thorough timeline of events before and immediately after the university published the report in your lecture subtitled, "The Half That's Never Been Told." Using a sequence of documentary evidence you suggested that the report was actually an intelligence document prepared by the anthropologist M. G. Smith, acting covertly on behalf of N. W. Manley, the Premier of Jamaica. The role of his co-authors Rex Nettleford and Roy Augier was less clear-cut. In the lecture you gave at the Institute of Jamaica in August you were much more definitive. This report is an academic betrayal, you declared. For the benefit of my readers who weren't privy to either of these talks, could you summarize what it is you're saying about the provenance of this foundational text in the discourse of Rastafari? Foundational it has proven to be, indeed, and yet also a betrayal of academic and intellectual transparency. The first problem is the so-called provenance of the report. This survey arose out of letters written to the principal of the UCWI, Professor Arthur Lewis, and to the resident tutor extramural studies, Mr. Rex Nettleford, by members of the Rastafari Brethren living in Kingston, the report claimed. These letters asked the college to assist the Brethren in various ways, especially in the educational field, and by publicizing the truth about the Brethren and the doctrine p. 7. After 5 years of researching the report, I have yet to find any such letters, though I have found numerous letters written by various brethren, but all of them dated after the commencement of the research on July 5. In point of fact, there are 4 letters written after the research began but none before the report was published and none of them ask for any investigation to be pursued or launched. In any case, these letters could not be said to constitute the raison d'etre of the report. It seems odd that we should have a batch of such letters written to the principal, but none of them written prior to the beginning of the research. What I have concluded is that the story of the letters is a fairy tale. It served as a propaganda ploy that was meant to disguise the real motive behind the university's investigation of the Rastafari movement. In other words, the story of the letters never had any foundation in fact. And in any case, if such letters existed, all that the defenders of the report have to do is to produce them. But since you can't produce what doesn't exist, their only resort is to keep repeating the story over and over, as if the mere repetition will make it become true. Meantime, it is worth observing that the report never identifies who the authors of the letters were, nor are any of the texts of the letters themselves made available. Assuming that it was these letters that triggered the university's response, one would think that they were important enough to include the names of the persons who wrote the requests. Put another way, should the omission be explained as a case of typical university condescension toward the self-same Rastafari brethren it claimed to be serving? Let us now connect the two elements that I have identified, namely, first, the mad haste with which the entire exercise was carried out, and, secondly, the explanation provided in the report as to who requested and asked for it to be done. Th. Ronald Trevor Henry, dressed in U.S. Air Force uniform. In point of fact, no worse time for launching an investigation of any kind of the Rastafari movement could be imagined or chosen. On June 21, 1960, 2 Royal Hampshire Marines in a combined military-police raid were shot and killed in an ambush in the Red Hills. The ambush was carried out by Ronald aka Reynold Henry, the son of Rev. Claudius Henry, and members of his 1st Africa Corps who had established a military training camp in a remote area in the Red Hills outside of Kingston. In all, 4 Royal Hampshire Marines were shot and 2 were killed. Henry and a group of his men fled after the ambush and escaped from the cordon, ending up in the Sligoville area of St. Catherine. For the next 6 days they were hunted down in the largest search operation that Jamaica had ever witnessed. Close to 1,000 military and police took part in the search. St. For the next 10 days, the front pages of the Gleaner newspaper were completely dominated by bold headlines announcing the progress of the search and eventual capture of the entire squadron from the Red Hills training camp, over 30 people in all. Jamaica at this time was in the grip of a moral and political panic. For all practical purposes, Jamaica was living under a state of emergency, with Rastafarians on lockdown throughout the country. It was hardly a propitious time, to say the least, to be going into the inner city and to be conducting interviews with members of the Rastafarian community. It would be like a group of academics deciding that they would undertake a research project in Tivoli Gardens during the crisis precipitated by the Dudus affair. I don't think so. However, if the true purpose of the report was security related, then the urgency and haste with which it was undertaken becomes understandable. In my opinion, that was exactly what happened. It was in that sense a classic counterinsurgency operation masquerading as a university-sponsored investigation. And like every counterinsurgency operation, it was accompanied by all of the deception and secrecy that are integral to the craft of counterintelligence. Intelligence was a specialty of M.G. Smith, the main architect of the report. Smith had been trained in military intelligence in World War II, serving with the Canadian Army as a member of the 17 Duke of York's Royal Canadian Hussars, a reconnaissance regiment with the 3 Canadian Infantry Division, which he enlisted in while still a student at McGill University in Montreal in April 1942. The intake interview with the young recruit records that he was asked by the interviewer to name the area of the military that he wished to serve in. Smith replied, "Intelligence." Th. Road. Smith's concern with the problem of social unrest was made explicit both in his private correspondence as well as in the report. Writing to his collaborator and fellow anthropologist, Vera Rubin, on June 23, 1960, Smith observed, "Perhaps you've already heard about our minor Castro-type antics in the Red Hills near Kingston this week. It seems as if my predictions about serious trouble in Jamaica may be fulfilled this year or next. The country is in a curious mood." On July 24, 1960, Smith followed up this letter to say that myself and the local Rasta S, whose hotels on the Foreshore Road I remember showing you and Lloyd Braithwaite one night, had got to some sort of mutual grips, by way of explaining what he called his unusual silence in the month that had elapsed between letters. With a palpable sense of relief, Smith went on to describe his feeling. Now I hope that the affair is over for me, but can see further interruptions from time to time. The fieldwork is done, the report written, revised and sent to the printers. With luck it should be on sale this Friday, 30. These antics explain my silence, for which apologies. M. G. Smith to Vera Rubin, July 24, 1960. Th. Those were semantics. But a month later, during which time Smith was involved as the government's chief go-between with the various Rastafarian communities, Smith's mood swung from positive to negative. I shall be going for a few days to the North Coast, he wrote to inform Rubin, to rest and clear my mind. For the past 5 or 7 weeks, this Rastafari business has simply run me into the ground. He poured out his frustration and his sense that he was misused. Hitherto, I have been unable to get any sort of action taken to forestall an increasingly explosive situation. Nothing can be more frustrating than futile knowledge in this condition. One sees the signs of a social breakdown, and sees too some of the measures necessary to forestall or reduce it, but one is also quite incapable of getting anybody to believe these things or act accordingly. Moreover, when the breakdown is at hand, I am the man who gets landed with the job of patching and stalling. M. G. Smith to Vera Rubin, August 20, 1960. The whole point of the investigation was to find a way to bring about peace. If pacification of the Rastafari movement was the goal, and it clearly was, the path chosen was political co-optation of the Brethren. The strategy was enunciated and contained in the topmost recommendation of the report. The government of Jamaica should send a mission to African countries to arrange for immigration of Jamaicans. Representatives of Rastafari Brethren should be included in the mission. p. 38. The strategy of co-optation, however, was contingent upon the government of Jamaica sanctioning and adopting it. This was the explanation for the report being sent to Premier Manley on July 20, as the letter of transmittal from the principal to Manley made a point of stressing. The Rastafari movement is large, and in a state of great unrest, Lewis wrote Manley, adding, its problems require priority treatment. The way forward would be dependent on the action of the Manley and the government. Th. Though the movement has no single leader or group of leaders, it is willing to produce a small group of prominent representatives to discuss with the government the recommendations contained in this report. I very much hope that you may be able to arrange such a meeting at the earliest possible opportunity. Based on the evidence, it is clear that the impetus for the report originated not from Rastafarians writing letters to the principal. When has the university ever bestirred itself on the basis of appeals from the downtrodden, but came from an agreement worked out between Manley, Smith, and Lewis? Why should a piece of university research, one that had been supposedly undertaken at the request of Rastafari Brethren, be prefaced by a letter directed to the Premier of Jamaica and submitted before it was released to the public? One can be quite certain that none of the Brethren were granted the privilege of seeing the report before its publication. Premier Manley was in possession of the manuscript of the report for a full 5 days before he returned it to Lewis. It was only after Manley had approved it and the manuscript was received back that it was taken to the printer to be published. Nettleford was the one responsible for taking the manuscript to the printer and overseeing its publication. A month and a half after the report was published, Smith informed Vera Rubin in New York, here the Rastafari pot continues to boil, but I think it's more manageable now, although I expect some organized violence when the Henry trial comes up. M. G. Smith to Vera Rubin, September 14, 1960. When I interviewed Mary Smith at her home in Glastonbury, England, in December 2007, I asked her whether her husband had met with N.W. Manley to discuss his plan for embarking on the investigation of the Rastafari movement. After explaining to me what a close family friend her husband was of the Manleys, for example, she told me, as a young man M. G. Smith spent summer holidays with the Manley family. She confirmed that Smith met with Manley in the run-up to the report. Very much so, she said. Th. That was one thing Mike said at the start. He said, if we're going to make recommendations we have got to be sure they can be carried out. If we make recommendations and the government says we can't do it, then we're in trouble, not the scholars, the government is in trouble. So before he worked out with Rex and Augier what recommendations they would make, he went and saw Norman and discussed that with him. Very much so, we had to, that was essential. And they agreed on what the government could undertake and what it couldn't. In fact, the government was very anxious to help. Norman was very sympathetic, and I think the sort of thing they would have done was to emphasize anything connected with education, training, skills, etc. To make sure all of that was very clearly set out. The recommendations were cleared with the government before the pamphlet was printed. From its very inception, Manley knew every detail of the university's plans, which were worked out in advance and in extremely close consultation between them. The fact that he was given the report in manuscript and had it for 5 days to study before it was released to the printer explains, moreover, how it was that Manley was able to issue a public statement the day after the release of the report. The report, as published in the Gleaner August 3, 1960, stated, "The Hon. Norman Manley, Premier, will meet a deputation from the leaders of the Rastafari movement to discuss migration of Jamaicans back to Africa. The government," he said, "accepted in principle the recommendation that a mission should go to Africa to investigate the possibilities of migration." The full text of the Gleaner report appears in the addendum. A basic question that imposes itself at this point is, did Principal Lewis or any of the university team inform members of the Rastafari groups with whom they met on July 4, 1960, at the Jonestown Elementary School, that the planning of the investigation had been worked out in close consultation with the Premier and that the report was to be submitted prior to its release to the government of Jamaica? It does not require a great deal of imagination to anticipate the uproar among the road. Th. Brethren that would have followed such a disclosure that night. In fact, if the brethren had been told any of this, the entire investigation would have been stopped in its tracks before it could get off the ground. It is doubtful that the university researchers would have been allowed access to the various Rastafarian camps had it been known beforehand who they were working for. In other words, the investigation was only able to proceed on the basis of a serious deception, namely, withholding of a key piece of information that was deliberately kept hidden from the brethren. Instead, the Rastafari brethren were misled and made to believe, like the public in general, that the initiative for the investigation had originated with the brethren. Such a deception constituted a betrayal of trust and a serious breach of intellectual honesty and academic transparency. Beyond the supposed threat to peace that the Rastafari brethren posed, there was a larger threat to security that haunted the report, the spectre of communist subversion. It was this spectre of black nationalism in the form of Rastafarianism, making common cause with the Marxism, that Smith found deeply unnerving. According to the report, for Jamaican leftists the violent part of the Rastafari spectrum is a gift. Capitalist, bourgeoisie and proletariat can be directly translated into white, brown and black. Revolution becomes redemption with repatriation as the issue, provoking bloodshed. The Marxist vanguard wears a Nyabingi cloak. In our survey we encountered certain groups among which the Marxist interpretation and terminology predominated over the racial religious. Events in Cuba, China, Egypt and elsewhere endow the Marxist analysis with a pragmatic validity and power. Insofar as this political philosophy employs the ideology of Rastafari racism, its spread throughout the bulk of the population is assured unless government takes positive steps to meet the legitimate needs of the lower classes, including the Rastafari group. The choice before Jamaica is that between social reform which is planned, peaceful and rapid on the one hand, or changes of a different sort. It is certain that Jamaican society cannot continue in its present form. Since economic development presumes social stability, this means that any successful development depends on an intelligent program of social reform. The recent spread of Rastafari doctrines among educated middle-class youth is largely due to the appeals of ganja and Marxism, but this spread will surely continue so long as Jamaican society fails to provide the young with significant ideals of social justice for which to strive, and opportunities for their achievement. pp. 25-26. In January 1961, in an unpublished paper prepared at the request of Manley, Smith not only repeated the concern expressed in the report, but also went further in analyzing the potential for violence. Smith's account of the threat reflects his unfailing focus on security matters and the need for a counterinsurgency strategy by the government of Jamaica. Here is what Smith, writing in January 1961, advised Manley. The Jamaican government has been pressing ahead with negotiations to get the mission to Africa underway. Its major difficulties have come from precisely that militant group of Rastafarians who strongly demanded the college survey and who have obvious Marxist interests. As the college report stated, the Marxist vanguard wears a Nyabingi cloak. Rebellion becomes redemption, with repatriation as the issue provoking bloodshed. The current strategy is thus perfectly clear. Either before the mission goes to Africa or at such time afterwards as seems most propitious, a violent uprising will be organized and justified on a number of ad hoc grounds. For instance, it may be said that the mission was framed by government, in that it contained the wrong sort of people or advisors, went to the wrong sort of places for the wrong reasons, or at the wrong times. It may also be claimed that government is oppressing the black population, especially the Rastafarians. Already the pattern of violence suggests that a suitable occasion will be selected for a demonstration in sufficient force to create a major public disturbance, perhaps shortly after or before parallel disturbances take place in the country parts. It is of cardinal importance to distinguish sharply the Marxist-oriented Rastafarians from others who lack this orientation. On my reckoning, even allowing for growth of Marxist influences in this movement in Kingston since August, it does not control more than 1/3 of the urban Rastafarians. However, this segment is active and effectively led. It is also highly intelligent. M.G. Smith, Race and Politics in Jamaica, unpublished Mus. January 1961. Smith never identified any of those he termed the Marxist-oriented Rastafarians, so it is unclear how much weight or reliance one should place on the existence of this category or even what exactly Smith meant by it. Likewise, the violent social blow-up that Smith kept anticipating and envisioning never materialized. The closest thing was the Coral Gardens incident, which took place on Thursday, April 12, 1963, when a group of young Rastafarian males, following prolonged harassment by the police, acting at the behest of wealthy developers and landowners in the vicinity of Rose Hall and the newly built Half Moon Hotel, to block their access to land they had been cultivating, went on a rampage to exact retribution against the police and property in the area. What Smith had in mind, however, was something that was much more general, something on the scale of a mass upheaval or insurrection in Jamaica. Isn't it true that the report in question actually makes an important intervention into how Rastafarians who were the butt of severe social scorn and prejudice were to be treated? It made the important point that Rastas were not to be feared and reviled or treated as enemies of the state. Isn't this why the report was eagerly consumed by the public? In other words, even if we accept your reading of the report as an intelligence tool, we have to admit that it has over the years done a lot of good, right? What you describe is a fairy tale. It sounds like an ex post facto rationalization of the report, an attempt at redeeming what is a seriously flawed document with a sort of virtuous outcome. To believe that it was the report that brought about the change that you suggest is to inflate the influence of the report out of all proportion to what actually occurred. It wasn't the report that brought about the change, it was the Rastafarian movement that brought about the change, not the university report. The Rastafarian Brethren seized the report and converted its recommendation for a mission to Africa into a tremendous counter-propaganda weapon. It was the intuitive genius of the Brethren that wrested control of the narrative in the ensuing ideological struggle. The biggest changes were still to come, however. The incredible music that poured forth in the 60s, all in the name of Jah Rastafari, swept everything and everyone before it. With the historic visit of Emperor Haile Selassie to Jamaica in April 1966, the winning of the battle for public opinion was complete. Moreover, the transformation you describe resulted from the broader social and cultural transformation that Jamaica underwent starting in the 60s. The process ran wide and deep and helped to push the entire country into a radical political direction. Something of this sweep and magnitude could not have resulted from the publication, no matter how important, of a 54-page university document. Finally, while it is true that the publication of the report caused something of a sensation at the time in Jamaica, both in terms of demand for copies of the report and the coverage that it engendered in the local press, it has to be remembered that the public reaction at the time was far from positive, as Rex Nettleford was careful to note in his book Mirror, Race, Identity, and Protest in Jamaica, 1970. The publication of the report was also greeted with considerable criticism, most especially from the pen of Monsignor Gladstone Wilson, whose role in this matter of the university report has been kept hidden from view until now. Another point you make in your critique is that the research conducted for the report was not only done in 2 weeks or 9 working days but was also restricted to Kingston, ignoring important Rasta groups such as Claudius Henry's Could you explain the significance of these omissions? In the press release issued at the very inception of the research, the university announced that the report would be completed and released in 2 weeks. A copy of the press release is reprinted in the addendum. The press release followed the meeting at the Jonestown Elementary School on July 4, 1960, at which the principal of the university, W. Arthur Lewis, met with a group of brethren, whereupon it was agreed to proceed with the investigation. The research team embarked on field work on the following morning, July 5, 1960. And on July 20, 1960, the report was completed and submitted to Premier Manley for his review. That makes 15 days between the inception of research and the formal transmittal of the report, but 14 days, if we allow a day for Lewis to prepare the letter of transmittal and physically submit the manuscript to Manley. Now, what kind of serious researcher or academic will announce at the very outset that such an important piece of work would be started and completed in 2 weeks?